Hi, welcome back to my Victory Point Games Basic Training series. We're going to wrap it up with this game, Paul Koenig's D-Day, Sword and Gold, the British Beaches. Number 4 of the historic gaming series, and it comes with 2 complete games inside. And it does come with 2 maps, 2 scenarios, and this pair is one of 3, well, this set is one of 3 in the series. There's another pair on the American beaches, Utah and Omaha, and then another single on just Juneau, the Canadian beach. I have another game by the same designer called Paul Koenig's Market Garden Arnhem Bridge, part of his Market Garden series, which is slightly lower in complexity according to Victory Point Games than this game. But reading the rulebook, I found that series is based upon this design, which, according to the designer, is based loosely on a game I'm not yet familiar with called Blood and Steel. And so because there's a bit more in common between those games, I decided to skip over Market Garden, Arnhem Bridge, jump right into this one. I don't know if I'll be playing both beaches or just one. We'll see. The complexity rating is 4 out of 9 versus the 3.5 that we see in Market Garden. Solitaire suitability is equally high at 8 out of 9, as high as you can get for a 2-player game. I think the 9 out of 9s are reserved for solitaire, or designed for solitaire games. Very useful information down here. Scale, each unit is 1 company to regiment, each hex is 1 kilometer, and each turn is about 4.5 hours of real time. Let's see here. The game comes with a set of standard rules that pertain to the entire system. 4 pages, here's a peek. As well as exclusive scenario-specific rules, one side of the sheet for Gold Beach, the other side for Sword Beach. We also get, this is normally the case now, seeing, a set of optional rules. A lot of these informational status markers pertain to the optional rules only. I probably won't be playing with these yet, at least not in this playthrough. But that's for added replayability in an optional advanced game if you're interested. Always appreciated. Although I tend to enjoy the standard rules only in a lot of these games. I haven't really experimented a lot with the optional rules though. We get another double-sided sheet, a very detailed example of play of the operations phase and the fire combat. The very large color illustrations, we'll see how useful that is. Might answer some rules questions I might have. And we also get, we don't get this espresso cup, but we get a little tiny die. This is for the chip pulling that we're going to see for the first time on this channel, which I think is why these games are so highly rated as far as their solitaire suitability. Another thing to note is that these counters are quite a bit smaller than what we saw in the Arduous Beginning and the Drive-On Mets. Even though the hexes of the map are about the same, I think that's because there's some interesting things when it comes to movement and combat in this game. We'll see. But just a hint, you can enter an enemy-occupied hex and engage in close combat in this game. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so I rolled a die and it's been determined that I will be playing Gold Beach for this playthrough. I have the board all set up with the German units in their starting locations. We had the map this way in the intro, flipped it 90 degrees. North is now in this direction. We have, let's see, our 4 stacks of 3 units each of Allied brigades, getting ready for the beachhead landings that take place over the course of the first 3 turns in 3 separate waves. We have HQ markers here, each corresponding, the top 4 here correspond to each of these Allied brigades, and the bottom 3 here correspond to the German regiments. There are 4 units here, another 4 units here making up the second, and the third up here, another 4 units. All of these will begin in the command cup. I should note that these starting units also have a hex location on the back side, which makes setup pretty easy. We'll throw these in the cup, and these will be drawn every turn one by one until the cup is empty. How do you win the Gold Beach scenario? Well, you get a certain number of victory points for occupying city and town hexes at the end of the game, specifically. Zooming in. These hexes with the thick red border are cities. For every city hex that you occupy at the end of the game, you gain 2 victory points. 1 victory point for every town hex, this thick orange border. The German player only also receives extra victory points at the end of the game for additional conditions. 1 victory point for each eliminated allied unit, and another victory point for each one of their own units that are still on the map at the end of the game and fully intact. Here's a close-up of the terrain effects chart. There are no swamp hexes in this on this map, but there's quite a bit of bocage. We got a couple of rivers. You can ignore the interdicted row. That's we're not using that optional rule in this playthrough. And then there's a reminder at the bottom when it comes to close combat. Over here we have our turn track, starting on the morning of June 6th. We have day turns and night turns. Turns 4 and 8 are night turns. And we end on turn 11 on the evening of June 8th, 1944. We also get, of course, our day sequence of play, night sequence of play, and battle sequence reminders. Looking at the day sequence of play, you can see that phase 1 is the landing phase. This really only happens during the first 3 turns, which are day turns, as there are 3 waves of Allied beachhead landings. What happens is that the Allied player places his newly landed units due to him that turn, and the German player conducts landing fire by rolling down here on this table. You can see that depending on what time of day it is, we have different types of outcomes, different probability. It's easier to inflict more damage earlier in the day. The second phase is the support phase. You can ignore the leadership and interdiction sub-phases. Those are part of special optional rules that we won't be using for this playthrough. So the first thing we do is determine artillery points. Both players each roll a die. You compare the results. The player with the higher roll receives the difference between the 2 rolls in artillery points. The Allied player would receive the entirety of that difference. The German player would only receive half. A rule that pertains to the entirety of this game, the rule of halves. Whenever a value is halved for any reason, always round fractions up. In this case, you would be rounding in your benefit, which is really counterintuitive coming from a Eurogamer standpoint. Then you would, the Allied player would determine how many Allied support points he receives. Those represent air and naval assets. He rolls a die on this table down here, the Allied support points available table, and can receive anywhere from 1 to 3. So those markers are over here. Red, there are 5 artillery markers, 3 Allied support markers available in the game. And then we move on to the operations phase, kind of the meat of the game. During the operations phase, draw chits, HQ chits one by one from the command cup until it's empty. And that's the end of the sequence of play. What does that mean? So for each HQ chit that you draw, all of the units corresponding to that formation, in this case we have the 151st Brigade, all the units that are on the board corresponding to that would be activated. We have 1 here. Active units are able to then conduct movement and or combat. There are 3 types of combat. There's close combat, the full fire attack, and the mobile fire attack. The unit may move up to its full movement allowance and conduct close combat, which we'll get into shortly. they can stay where they are and attack into an adjacent hex using a full fire attack. There are exceptions, we'll get into that again shortly. Or you can do a combination of the two. You can move up to half of your movement allowance, conduct any close combat where applicable, and then conduct a mobile fire attack, which uses only half of the unit's combat strength. This is a very interesting thing about this game. There are no zones of control in this game. In any of the games in this series, or I think in the Market Garden series by the same designer. So they need not stop when moving adjacent to enemy units. They can kind of maneuver around a unit, continue along their way. However, they must stop when entering a hex with an enemy unit. So they can actually, as you've probably already figured out, enter an enemy-occupied hex, and then by doing that, they enter close combat. They're immediately engaging in close combat. There's a stacking limit of 2 units per hex that applies to both players collectively at all times. So that means that in order to enter close combat, a single friendly unit would have to enter a hex containing a single enemy unit. Learning as we go here. Here's a close-up of the battle sequence. So the first step is the preparation step. The attacker indicates the target hex, which contains at least 1 enemy unit, and then indicates what type of attack he's conducting. One of the 3 that I mentioned, full fire attack, mobile fire attack, or close combat. These attacks cannot be combined. Then he adds the total combat strength to determine the attack factor. If there are multiple units performing the same type of operation, they can fire in concert, together, jointly, into the same hex. I should clarify this concept of combined operations, combined movement in combat. A unit may both move half of its movement allowance, including entering close combat, which is a +2 movement point cost, and conduct a mobile fire attack, which uses only half of its combat strength. You can shoot first and then move, or move and then shoot, but you cannot move, attack, and move again. If you're doing a combination of close combat and a mobile fire attack, you can do those in either order as long as the movement occurs at the end of the turn, at the end of that operation. The second step of the battle sequence is the defensive support step, in which the defender can assign artillery and or allied support points to the battle, these red and blue markers. There's a special rule here. If the Germans are facing a full fire attack, they may retreat before combat. He may opt to retreat his unit or units in the target hex instead of receiving the attack. If the German player elects to do so, the Allied player may freely and immediately change the operation for his units conducting that full fire attack to a combined operation only. The third step is the offensive support, during which the attacker may assign available artillery and or allied support points to the battle. The restriction for those support points is that if available to him, each player may commit up to 1 artillery support point, and for the allied player only, up to 2 allied support points if available to each battle that turn, whether attacking or defending. Only the net difference would apply between the defensive support and the offensive support. During close combat, after this point, you would enter what's called the defensive close fire step, in which the defending unit conducts a close fire attack against the attacking unit. And if that defensive attack inflicts a hit even in an exchange, then retreating is conducted and that close combat is over. So he rolls a die. If the roll is less than the attack factor, one hit is scored on the target unit. If the roll is equal to the attack factor, an exchange occurs where both sides receive a single hit. If the roll is greater than the attack factor, the result is a miss. There are markers to indicate how many hits the unit is inflicted on another unit. And then if the defensive close fire attack missed, the attacking unit must conduct a close fire attack against the defending unit, doing the same thing. If the offensive attack inflicts a hit, even in an exchange, then retreating is conducted, same thing, and that close combat is over. If the offensive fire attack missed, then either player, beginning with the defender, has the option to retreat and end the close combat. If both players decide to stay there and remain engaged, then they repeat the defensive close fire step and offensive close fire step sequence, including the option to retreat between rounds of fire. There are no terrain effects on close combat. Both sides are occupying the same terrain. In close combat, the net value of support points remains consistent and in full force, modifying the committing side's attack factor only throughout every round of battle. Okay. So throughout the whole steps 4 and 5 repeated. Then at the end, a unit that initiates a close combat battle must end its turn after the battle's resolution. It may not initiate further movement or fire attacks that turn. Okay. If it's a full fire attack or a mobile fire attack, they're the same thing, except that the mobile fire attack, the attacking unit's combat strength is halved. What you would do after the defensive and offensive support steps is determine the terrain effects modifier, looking at the chart there, and then roll a die to resolve the combat as normal with the whole less than. If the roll is less than the attack factor, that's a hit. If it's equal, that's an exchange. Both sides receive a hit. If it's greater than the attack factor, the result is a miss. Okay, so you want to roll low in this game. Retreats. Okay. Retreating units are moved by their owning player into an adjacent hex not occupied by enemy units, or two friendly units, so you can't violate the stacking limit. In close combat, defending units cannot retreat into hexes. Hex the attacking units entered from, okay, and from the line of attack, I guess, or the attack path, and attacking units can only retreat back to that entry hex. Okay. Units that must retreat but cannot are eliminated instead. That's pretty typical. On the edge, okay, yeah. Hold. An undamaged attacking unit that suffers an exchange result from close fire may opt to take a second hit in lieu of retreating to hold ground. That's interesting. Units may be retreated off of the edge of the map. If they do, they cannot re-enter play, but are not considered eliminated for victory purposes. Remember, that's one of the scoring conditions. During night turns, you get 2 phases. The first is a replacements phase. Both players roll a die, and they can get anywhere from 0 to 5 replacement points that they assign one by one, starting with the allied player. One at a time, reducing or removing hit markers from their friendly units. If you roll a 6, you get 0 replacement points. Then it's the German night movement phase, or the German redeployment phase. in which the German player may move any or all of his units that did not receive replacements up to half of their movement allowance. Then you enter the housekeeping phase, advance the turn marker if it's the last turn, determine the winner based on this scenario-specific victory conditions, and that's an overview of the games. So let's jump into the playthrough.